Turn in our Bibles, that's pretty hot, to Acts chapter 25. We're going to begin just by reading the entire chapter. So if you have a Bible, it will be really helpful for you to open up and follow along. Acts chapter 25. It says, "Now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, he said, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, to Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go. Now when some days had passed, Agrippa the king and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and greeted Festus. And as they stayed there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, there is a man left prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews laid out their case against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it was not the custom of the Romans to give up anyone before the accused met the accusers face to face and had opportunity to make his defense concerning the charge laid against him. So when they came together here, I made no delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought. When the accusers stood up, they brought no charge in his case of such evils as I had supposed. Rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss as how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wanted to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding him. But when Paul had appealed to be kept in custody for the decision of the emperor, I ordered him to be held until I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you will hear him. So on the next day, Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp, and they entered the audience hall with the military tribunes and the prominent men of the city. Then, at the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa, and all who are present with us, you see this man about whom the whole Jewish people petitioned me, both in Jerusalem and here, shouting that he ought not to live any longer. But I found that he had done nothing deserving death. And as he himself appealed to the emperor, I decided to go ahead and send him. But I have nothing definite to write to my lord about him. Therefore I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. If you've been with us for the last several weeks, you know we're in the part of the story of Paul in Acts where he just he continually is dragged before one session to the next session where he is defending himself before the Jews and before Roman rulers and he has been in prison now, in jail in Caesarea for 2 years, even though the previous governor, Felix, said, there's nothing wrong. There's no wrongdoing here, but I'm going to keep him in prison as a favor to the Jews, and maybe I'll get a bribe out of this thing and line my own pockets. And this is where we pick up in chapter 25. Felix has now passed off the scene, and a new governor has taken his place. The governor's name is Festus. And again, like we said last week, we can start to ask ourselves the question, what can we possibly gain from this bit of information? Why would Luke record this? Why would the Spirit of God record this encounter between not only Paul and Festus, but the conversation between Festus and Agrippa? Outside of just historical interest and historical detail to kind of satisfy our curiosity of what's going on, is there a spiritual point, and is there one beyond what we've already talked about? Just kind of the common theme of these chapters is, hey, if you follow Christ, you're going to be persecuted. But I think if we look with fresh eyes and ask ourselves again the question, why did Luke record what he does for Theophilus? Why would he go through the trouble of giving us all of these words that just seem to repeat? And then this encounter between Agrippa and Festus, that historically interesting, but is there anything that we can glean from it? And here's what I think the answer is. Why did Luke write this to Theophilus? I think he's answering a question. The question is, how did the gospel of Jesus Christ spread so far so quickly? How did it go from being this little offshoot of Judaism to now even men like Theophilus have not only heard, but have believed? How did we get there? The short answer is that God is sovereign over the entire world. And He will bring about His plans through whatever means He decides is best. The longer, more detailed answer, I think we find in Acts chapter 25. What exactly do those plans look like? Now, the chapter breaks down into kind of 3 sections, I think. You have a request rejected. You have an appeal approved. And you have a king's curiosity. And these 3 stages serve to propel the gospel forward, not only in Caesarea, but ultimately towards Rome, the capital of the empire. And here's the takeaway. How did the gospel spread so far so fast? It was because the world has unwittingly served to spread that gospel. Was certainly not their intention. Was certainly not what they had planned. Their goal was to put the clamps on this new religion. But in the process of their attack, they unwittingly served to spread it. Why? Because God is sovereign over the affairs of this world. So we get in verses 1 through 5 a request that is rejected. Festus comes onto the scene. Felix has passed off the scene. We don't know a ton about this man, Festus. We do know, however, that though the powerful of the world have passed away, they've moved on. Felix has been recalled to Rome because, quite honestly, he did a terrible job, according to history. Felix passes off the scene, but Paul remains. He's still in prison, but he is still here, and he's still at the center of the story. Isn't it interesting that it is the powerful who are often soon removed from the scene, while it is God's servant who remains? Reminds us in Luke chapter 1 of Mary's words in verse 51 when she says, "He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and has exalted those of humble estate." The world values power and position and influence, doesn't it? But God is not impressed with any of those things. What is truly important in God's kingdom on the grand stage of his divine plan is humility, which is counter to the world's value system. Folks, Paul never made his ministry about him. It was never about his exaltation. It was never even about his freedom. It was ultimately about the exaltation of Christ and the advance of his gospel. So right from the start this morning, we're left with a question already, aren't we? What do you value? What are you pursuing? What is important to you? Is it power? Is it influence? Is it security? Is it freedom? The weakness of this world, the weakness of the powers of this world will continue to show up in this chapter. Not only are they powerless to stop the spread of the gospel, but they are actually pushing it forward, moving it on. Now this guy Festus, we don't know a ton about him. There's not a lot recorded in history about him. We know he ruled in this province from around AD 54 to AD 60. Josephus, because you guys like when we quote from him. Remember, he's the Jewish historian that lived from roughly 30 AD to about 97 AD, I believe. He writes about Festus. He said, "Festus, who succeeded Felix as procurator, proceeded to attack the principal plague of the country. He captured large numbers of the brigands and put not a few to death." In other words, the one thing we know about Festus is he took care of a problem that Felix did not, and that was the assassinations that were occurring. These men that were attempting to stir trouble in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. Felix kind of sat on his hands and was doing very little to stop what was going on, to stop the crime. Festus steps in and with a very strong hand takes care of the issue. He appears to be a man of action. Again, unlike Felix, who was willing to put Paul away for 2 years and do nothing. He didn't want to make a decision because he didn't want to stir up the Jews. He didn't want to let Paul go, even though he was innocent. But at the same time, he didn't want to move and condemn Paul because he knew he was guilty. So what do? We just don't make any decision at all. We just leave him here for 2 years. Festus, on the other hand, you kind of get the idea through just this one chapter, he's a man of action. It says he comes to power, he goes to the capital of Caesarea, he's only there 3 days. All right, we move in, we get everything settled as best we can, and now we're off. And where are we going? We're going to Jerusalem, which kind of serves as a secondary capital in the area, another very important city that was now under his authority, and he goes there. Why? It's politically the right thing to do. Let's go check in with the constituents. This is an important city full of important people. The Sanhedrin are there. They've got a certain amount of authority even in this Roman structure. Let's go meet with them. Let's hear their concerns. He was a man of action. So in verse 2, he goes to the Jews and he hears the concerns of the Sanhedrin, and it's almost shocking, isn't it? Just put the timeline together here. Paul has been in prison in Caesarea for 2 years. A new governor is in place, and he comes to the Sanhedrin and says, "What are your concerns?" "Well, Governor, there's this guy in Caesarea. We want you to bring him down here to Jerusalem so we can ultimately have our due with this man. Justice can be served. And Luke lets us in on the fact that they are scheming still to kill this guy on the way. It's a new old plan, right? We've already seen this. They've already schemed to try and kill Paul while he was under Roman authority. Paul survived that. He survived 2 years in prison, a new high priest, and yet their hatred persists. It's remarkable that given the opportunity to speak to a new governor, you're not concerned about social reforms, tax relief for the middle class. No, their first priority, kill Paul. We got to kill Paul. It's a reminder, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, that evil is relentless and it is often working in the shadows. Paul certainly had no idea that this kind of thing was going on and that they still were planning to attack and destroy him. But what we find out here also about evil is that not only is it relentless and not only is it working in the shadows, but it is irrational. This is irrational anger towards a man who had done nothing to violate Jewish law. And folks, this is an important reminder for us that our hope then, if evil is often irrational, we cannot pin our hopes to rational argumentation alone. I mean, folks, how often have we looked on in recent years in astonishment as our society swallows moral ideology that is clearly irrational? Listen, non-binary gender ideology is not rational. There is nothing rational about watching a young man compete and win against women. There's nothing rational about the preborn being defined as non-human and therefore expendable. There is nothing rational about the idea that random events happen, random particles collided, and we have life. It's not rational. But yet, if we suppose that sound logical argumentation is the solution to these issues, then you've greatly underestimated the problem. The root of the problem is not that we are surrounded by idiots and we're the only bastion of clear-headed people left on the planet. Let that sink in for just a minute. I was proud of that sentence when I wrote it. Let's be honest with you. The problem is not merely rational. The problem is that evil is relentless, it is shadowy, and it is not always concerned with logic. Evil is a spiritual problem that begs for a spiritual solution. It is a heart problem long before it is a head problem. Now listen, does that mean that we just abandon all attempts at logical argumentation? No, right? We shouldn't seek to be imbeciles. Understand what's going on in the world around you. Learn. Become educated. But understand that the success of the gospel mission is not dependent on the strength of our minds, but on the power of God Himself. Festus denies their request. We're not really sure why he does so. Doesn't really appear that he's had any prior knowledge of this plan to kill Paul. Maybe he was informed of their previous attempt when he was briefed about Paul's case. Either way, we're almost surprised that he makes such a reasonable decision here. Hey, why don't you bring him down to Jerusalem? We'll try him here. And Festus is like, he's in Caesarea. That's the capital. He's a Roman citizen. And he needs his shot. He needs to stand before a Roman tribunal, not Jewish. So you need to come and stand before me. You need to meet him face to face in a court of law. We're not really sure why, what motivated Festus to be so rational. We find out later he is motivated to appease the Jews. There's no doubt about it. He's got a troublesome constituency here in Jerusalem. The political senses here in this man would certainly be going, I don't want to stir up issues. I'm trying to put down fires in Jerusalem. I don't need more. But yet he does not permit their request to stand. And at the end of the day, folks, what we're left to conclude is that Festus unwittingly aids the advance of the gospel by refusing to give in to the pressures from the Jews. To him, it was just a rational decision. This makes legal sense. I might make some people a little bit angry over here. But behind the scenes, God is using the decisions of the powerful to accomplish his purposes, and in this case, to spare the life of his servant. Festus easily could have shipped Paul to Jerusalem. It would have been seen as a political concession. It would have been politically expedient, but for whatever reason, he doesn't. He denies the request. But the result is the gospel, through the ministry of Paul, is preserved. Verse number 6. Through verse number 12, we find an appeal that is approved. So Festus spends somewhere between 8 and 10 days in Jerusalem. He returns to the capital city of Caesarea, and the Jews follow him. Right? Again, relentless. You say we can't try him here? That's fine. We'll make the trip to Caesarea. Which, oh, by the way, they had already done 2 years prior, and now they're going to do it again in order to try and convince this new governor that Paul is worthy of dying. And so here we go again. Yet another trial where Paul has to defend himself against the false charges of the Jews. And it says that Festus goes up and he sits in the tribunal. That word tribunal is the word bema. It's the judgment seat. It would have been an elevated seat that the governor or the ruler would have sat on, and this was the seat from which he would make his judgments concerning the issues that are brought to him, the court cases, as it were. So he takes his seat, and Luke kind of summarizes the proceedings for us, basically saying this: the Jews make a bunch of baseless, unprovable charges, and Paul denies them all, right? Same story. The Jews are basically throwing everything against the wall to see what might stick. And Paul just says they can't prove any of it. None of it is true. I am innocent. But now Festus throws a curveball. Verse number 9, it says, "But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, 'Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me?'" Again, here I think is the political pressure coming against Festus. This man is clearly innocent. These are baseless charges, but if I just let him go, there's potentially two issues here. Number one, he could potentially be a dead man walking. This is a dangerous situation. If I just let him go, he could very well meet the knife of an assassin. But also, if I let him go, these people are so committed to his death that I could lose their support. My governorship could be a really short one if they start complaining to Caesar again about the troubles in Jerusalem. So he offers what seems to be a bit of a compromise, a way to appease the Jewish leaders, yet protect Paul from an unjust ruling at the hands of the Sanhedrin. I think that's what he means when he includes "before me" in verse number 9. Hey, Paul, do you want to go to Jerusalem? We'll appease these people, but I will ultimately be the final arbiter, right? I'll be the one ultimately making the decision as to whether or not you were guilty. It'll be before me and not them. They won't be the ones making the final verdict about whether you are guilty or not. But ultimately, he has to leave the decision to Paul. Paul was a Roman citizen. He had every right to be tried in a Roman court, and that was exactly Paul's point in verse number 10. I am standing before Caesar's bema seat, Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I have done no wrong, and you yourself know this very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. Well, look, it's not as if Paul was trying to get away with something here. Paul said several times, I've got a clean conscience before man and before God. He's not proclaiming himself perfect. He's not saying I've never done anything wrong. They say my conscience is clean. The wrongs that I have done, I have confessed. God has forgiven. I have made them right. My conscience is clean. And he's basically saying, listen, if I've done the crime, I will do the time. Which is different, I think, often than the way that we approach the notion of clean conscience or forgiveness. I think oftentimes we're more motivated by getting out of the potential time, whatever the consequence might be, than we are by clear conscience before God and man. We prefer getting out of trouble. And oftentimes I think that is our goal more than restored relationship with God, fellowship with God, and restored fellowship with his people. And a good testimony. So Paul then makes an unexpected and bold move. He says, I appeal to Caesar. Now, a little background here. Roman citizens had the right in any charge that was brought against them to appeal to be heard by Caesar himself. Now, historically, this meant that it would have been kind of a trial by peers. You would go to Rome, but it would have been the citizenry that would have heard your case, and they would have decided. But as power is consolidated under the Caesars, it becomes Caesar himself who hears the issues and makes the ruling on them. So Paul appeals to Caesar, meaning he gets the opportunity now to make his argument, to have his case heard by the emperor himself. Now, I've heard a lot of people question Paul's decision. I've heard a lot of people accuse Paul of trying to manipulate his way to Rome instead of trusting the Lord just a little while longer, right? If Paul would have held on just a little while longer, he could have gotten to Rome as a free man. And the reason they say this is because at the end of chapter 26, he's standing before King Agrippa. He makes his defense, and King Agrippa says in verse 32, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. And so people then look back and go, well, if Paul would have only had enough faith to wait a few more days, Agrippa would have set him free, and he could have gone to Rome as a free man. But there's a few issues with this. Number one, there's nothing indicating anywhere in this story that Paul would have gotten a favorable decision if it would have come to it. There is nothing indicating that Agrippa would have said the same thing had the decision actually fallen to Agrippa. The reality is Agrippa is saying what he said. Hey, this man could have gone free, but he can say that because he's not making the decision. The pressure's not on him now. It's easy to say something like that when you have no skin in the game. All of the pressure now is going to Caesar. So it's very easy for Agrippa to sit back and say, we could have let this guy go. But the pressure would have been very different had he been the one making the decision, knowing how the Jews would have responded. The other reason why I don't think it's appropriate to accuse Paul of faithlessness here is because for Paul, again, to have walked free into Caesarea, out from Roman protection, would have been extremely dangerous. These people were plotting to kill him at every turn. And I think Paul is thinking in his mind, God said I'm going to go to Rome. If I'm going to get there, what better way than under Roman protection? What better way? What do we have here? Festus says, yeah, I'll confer with my people. To Caesar you have appealed. To Caesar you will go. What we have, folks, is the servant of the gospel making a bold move in order to spread the gospel. This is how the gospel moves. It is through the bold decisions made by servants of the gospel who desire the spread of the gospel more than their own security, more than their own freedom. As I thought through this week, I was reminded 8 years ago, there was a church just to our east who made the decision to help a struggling church right here in Holiday. That church was carrying a heavy debt load, suffering the loss of family after years of unhealthy practices. And that church was weeks away from closing its doors. Yet this church decided to make a bold move. And that bold move was to put their resources at play for the sake of this body of believers. They risked resources. They risked giving up their own members, their own money, and their own time to see the gospel shine from this church once again. It was a bold move. It was not guaranteed success. But they did it for the purpose of the gospel in Holiday. Folks, several years after that, this church decided to take on a couple of missionaries because many of you wanted to prioritize gospel ministry to other regions even when our budget was so tight we couldn't afford a full-time pastor ourselves. That was somewhat of a bold move. At the beginning of last year, you decided to take on a full-time pastor, though our budget wasn't quite all the way there yet, because you wanted to prioritize gospel ministry here at home. It's kind of a bold move. And now, although we're still small, we are looking to the future, and we're asking and we are praying, Lord, what bold moves are next? What moves, what do we step into now in order to see the gospel take root in our community? To see it spread further into the recesses of our neighborhoods and our families and our schools and our places of business. So though we are still small, we are moving forward prayerfully with a recovery ministry. We're committing both money and people to the task in the hope that it might provide greater inroads for the gospel into our surrounding community. Why? Because there are people here willing to take bold steps for the sake of the gospel. We are praying that we might be part of another church plant in 5 years. Folks, that is a bold request. We're in no place to plant or even help plant another church right now. But we want to pray that way because we desire to see the gospel continue to spread through West Pasco County. You know, there's that phrase, fortune favors the bold. We'll rework that into a little bit longer phrase. It says, those who are bold for the gospel can move forward with the knowledge that God desires the same thing. And you know, I think that's the difference between boldness and foolishness. One is seeking what God desires, while the other is acting as if God doesn't exist. And that results in rash decisions based on our felt needs rather than a steady commitment to follow the Lord, even when doing so is really intimidating. And listen, God may close some doors, and that's okay, but we should move forward with bold plans and bold prayers for the sake of the gospel. Not for the sake of filling church coffers, not even for the sake of filling and becoming a larger church ourselves, but for the sake of seeing the gospel advance in our community. You have appealed to Caesar. To Caesar you will go. Now listen, we're going to find out at the end of this chapter, as the chapter concludes, that part of the reason Festus had to confer here, I think, about whether or not to permit Paul and to approve his appeal is because he has no idea what to write to Caesar about this guy. I need to send a log. I need to send a brief to Caesar about why we're sending this guy to him. And I have no idea what to say. He's innocent, and I do not understand the religious charges that are being made against him. I don't even know what to tell Caesar. And yet he agrees to send him anyway. Why? Because the world unwittingly serves the spread of the gospel. He had no idea what he was doing. And folks, I think we can expect that as we step forward into making bold moves for the sake of the gospel in our community, that our government, that the powers that be will continue to unwittingly serve the advance of the gospel. Whether they come alongside in agreement or whether they are actually trying to stop what God has set in motion, at the end of the day, the best they can do is continue the plans that God has already set in motion. Folks, that ought to engender boldness in us. If God is for us, what can man do to us? Not even the power of this world can stop what God has determined. Festus' decision, as self-serving as it may have been, unwittingly served to spread the gospel, even to Rome. Now we come to the end of the chapter. Verses 13 to 27, we have this king arrives, and he is curious about what is taking place with Paul. Festus explains, here's what's going on. I've got this guy, he's been here for 2 years. He was under Felix, and now it's kind of fallen to me, and I don't know what to do with him, Agrippa. Now let's understand just a little bit about who Agrippa is. It says Agrippa and Bernice show up. Agrippa is called the king. This is Herod Agrippa II. So again, we keep going back in our memory blocks. We go back to the Gospels. You remember the guy that had all of the male babies 2 years of age and under in Bethlehem? He had them all killed. That was King Herod the Great. He was the grandfather of this man, Agrippa II. Agrippa II's father, Agrippa I, was the guy who went into Caesarea, and they praised him, and he's a god and not a man. And God killed him right in the assembly. Right? Here's the family tree. And now you get Agrippa II. By the way, if you remember last week, Governor Felix was married to a woman whose name was Drusilla. Drusilla is Agrippa II's sister. Okay, so there's all kinds of family connections going on here, and it gets worse. Okay, so stay with me. It says he comes with a woman named Bernice. Oh, by the way, he's a king. He was a king, but the kings, Rome allowed kings over certain territories. They served as vassals of the state of Rome, right? So he was kind of the ruler of this territory, but he ruled under Caesar ultimately. But he comes to visit his new governor in his capital in Caesarea, and Bernice comes with him. Now, you might assume that Bernice is his wife, because that would make sense. The king and the queen, they would travel together, and there's the great pomp, and they come. Bernice is not Agrippa's wife. Bernice is Agrippa's sister, his other sister, Drusilla and Bernice. Drusilla, according to Josephus, the historian, was the beautiful one. Bernice was the jealous one. We're going to read Josephus again. You ready? You had no idea you were getting so much Josephus this week. Here's what Josephus says about Bernice. Josephus says, "But as for Bernice, she lived a widow a long while after the death of Herod." Okay, this is Herod, king of Chalcis, who was both her husband and her uncle. Okay? Now that Herod dies in about AD 48, so now she becomes a widow. Josephus continues, but when the report went out that she had criminal conversation with her brother Agrippa II, right? Keep that little interesting phrase in your mind, criminal conversation, she persuaded Polemo, who was king of Cilicia, to be circumcised and to marry her, as supposing that by this means she would prove those calumnies or false charges, false accusations upon her to be false. And Polemo was prevailed upon, and that chiefly on account of her riches. Yet did not this matrimony endure long, but Bernice left Polemo, and as was said, with impure intentions. Okay, so let's put together, what is Josephus saying? Josephus said she had a criminal conversation with her brother. What does that mean? Like, were they talking about tax evasion? They're talking about killing a rival? Are they talking about tearing off those do not remove stickers, tags from your mattresses? Like, what kind of criminal conversation are they having? The little phrase criminal conversation means an incestuous relationship. Okay? This was the rumor mill that started to stir. She moves in with her brother. And the word gets out that this is what's going on between the two of them. Now listen, even in the Roman Empire, and all of its moral degradation, incest was looked down upon. And so in order to put an end to the rumors, she decides to marry Polemo, who's the king of Cilicia, a neighboring territory. But he had to be circumcised. That's a big ask, okay? Let's just be honest for a minute. He decides to do it, not because he loves her, but because she's very wealthy, okay? So the two of them get married. But it doesn't last long. Josephus said that she left Polemo, and as was said, with impure intentions. What were the impure intentions? To go back to her brother, Agrippa II. Okay? This is the couple that arrives in Caesarea. This is the couple that Paul is now going to have to defend himself to. You go, man, that doesn't sound fair. That doesn't sound right at all, right? Because sometimes in gospel ministry, well, let's face it, a lot of times, living life as a Christian, the world and the affairs of this world just seem upside down, don't they? Just seems completely out of whack. But Paul's going to have to defend himself yet again to Agrippa and Bernice this time. Well, Festus explains Paul's case in verses 14 through 19. We won't take the time to read it all again, but verse 19 I think is the most interesting. He gives an evaluation of the problem as he sees it between Paul and the Jews. He says in verse 19, rather, they had certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. In other words, listen, from what I can gather, this is a purely religious dispute. It has something to do with this guy, Jesus, who the Jews say is dead. Paul says he's alive. I don't know what they're talking about, okay? And I don't get what the big deal is. John Calvin, writing about this in his commentary, said, he, Festus, showeth plainly how negligently he heard Paul when he disputed of Christ, whereby we see how little preaching availeth. Yea, that it availeth nothing at all, unless the Spirit of God do inwardly touch the hearts of men. For the wicked do lightly pass over whatever is spoken, as if a man should tell them a tale of Robin Hood. In other words, preaching is worthless. That's a great, hey, let's go do this again, right? Calvin says, listen, preaching is worthless. You might as well be telling tales of Robin Hood unless the Spirit of God moves in the heart of the people. You want to know what the difference is between Paul and Felix and Festus? They all had encounters with the gospel. The difference being that the Spirit of God regenerated Paul's heart. There was conviction with Felix, but there was not regeneration. There was no faith. And there doesn't even appear to be conviction with Festus. He's like, I don't even know what this is talking about. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. Folks, if you ever wonder why some people can listen to the Word of God today And one person will go away changed, and the other goes away saying, you know what, I don't know, it was good. It was about Paul, and, he seemed to really have a hard time, but I guess God was there for him, and maybe God can be there for me too. But I'm sure glad I'm not in jail. Sure glad I'm not Paul. If you ever wonder why people can go away from the Word of God, from a sermon, from a message, with two completely different responses? It's not because one is smart and one is not. It is because one met with the Spirit of God and the other did not. And you know what? If you are one of the ones that walks away changed, it is not to your credit then. It is to the credit of God Himself that you gain anything from His Word. And how that humbles us. They show up with a lot of pomp and circumstance. We don't really have anything to relate this to, I don't think, in American culture so much. You got to think of like British, like the changing of the guard, the Queen. They got all the pomp and circumstance. They know how to do pomp and circumstance in England. Right? Verse number 23, it says that Agrippa and Bernice show up, great pomp. They knew how to make an entrance. It's contrasting with Paul, who's just brought in, right? One great pomp, the other just in chains. Here he is. Again, we see the contrast of the power of this world versus the humility of the gospel servant. If you let your eyes scan down to verse number 26, Festus, now that this tribunal has convened here with Agrippa and Festus, several other of the leaders of the city are there. And Felix gives this overview. He says, but I have nothing definitive to write to my Lord about him. Like, hey, look, here's this guy. This is what the accusations are. I don't see anything wrong with him, but I have nothing definitive to write to my Lord. I have nothing to say to Caesar about him. I don't know what to say. Therefore, I have brought him before you all, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after we have examined him, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable in sending a prisoner not to indicate the charges against him. I don't know what to write. I'm hoping you do, Agrippa. Agrippa was part Jew. Agrippa was a religious man. He was a devout man. He would have known the theological nuances of what's going on here. Hey, Agrippa, I need help. I'm sending this guy to Caesar, and I don't want to look like an idiot. It's my first 2 weeks on the job, man. I got to have something to tell Caesar about this guy. Folks, we get the point yet again. The world serves to advance the gospel, this time through their own confusion and coordination. Festus is like, I don't know. So he coordinates with Agrippa, two very powerful men, making up a powerful court. And what happens? Paul is able to speak the gospel, we'll see this next week, directly to King Agrippa. Remember way back in Acts chapter 9, the Lord comes to Ananias. He says, hey, I want you to go meet with Saul. And the Lord said to Ananias, go, for Paul is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings. Here these two men are conferring because there is confusion about what to do with this guy, Paul. And in their confusion, they serve to advance the purposes of God for which He has called Paul. Not only were these two powerful men, along with all the political persuasion of the Sanhedrin, incapable of stopping the spread of the gospel, but every decision they make only serves its spread. Folks, the world cannot stop the gospel. In fact, everything they do serves to spread the gospel. Everything this court does in Caesarea serves to get the gospel into the ears of a king and ultimately into the ears of the household of Caesar himself. Paul's going to go to Rome. He's going to speak. He's going to do so under the protection of Rome itself. And the gospel is going to reverberate through the house of Nero. Now, at this point, Nero, in his reign, early on, history tells us he was a pretty stable guy. Seemed to be doing all right. It'll be a few years after this incident right here that things change dramatically, and he begins active persecution of Christians. But folks, not even Nero could stop the spread of the gospel. He only serves to spread it further. As persecution comes to the church, you know what happens? The church scatters, and the gospel goes with them. Folks, this ought to encourage us to be bold for the gospel's sake. What weapon can be formed against us, Isaiah asks. If the Lord is on our side, then who can stand against us? What about you? What bold plans can you make for the sake of the gospel? Perhaps the bold plan that God would have you to follow through on means planning to get to know your neighbor for the purpose of sharing the gospel with that neighbor. Perhaps the bold plan means signing up to be a disciple maker for our Hope for Addiction program. Just throwing that out there. Perhaps. What bold step can you take for the sake of the gospel where you are? You go, I don't know anybody. That's a problem. By the way, it's a problem that the Hope for Addiction thing might help solve. There's an opportunity for people just to be brought to you. If you don't know anyone, then maybe the bold step is, I need to get someplace where there are unbelievers. I need to take a bold step into something that might be a little bit uncomfortable. Folks, would you pray bold prayers for the sake of the gospel in our community? Would you pray for our recovery program that's coming? Would you pray for God's will concerning church planting? Would you pray that God would extend his gospel into the darkest corners of our community? Bold prayers, followed by bold plans and bold actions. Let's pray together. Lord,